With less than 4 days to go until the NHL trade deadline, it's time for the final edition of the Locked On Oilers Trade Deadline Big Board. See you in a second.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone that's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On today's show, going to go position group by position group ahead of Friday's trade deadline. Forwards, D, goalies in our 1-2-3 segment format order as per usual. So, to start our conversation, I think it's important that we frame this in a few ways. Number one, the Oilers have a lot of balls up in the air right now. It is unclear what the status of Evander Kane will be by Friday's trade deadline. It is unclear whether or not the Oilers will be able to find a way to move him. We talked about this extensively on Monday's edition of Locked On Oilers, where we broke down the various reasons why it's going to be difficult for the Oilers to do so. This is a player that hasn't played since last June, a player who's going to need several weeks to ramp up their conditioning to be ready to play in playoff games with not a lot of regular season remaining. His price point, over $5 million per season, is a little cost prohibitive for some teams. And the other conundrum there, if a team were to acquire him, they would need to have the cap space to have him on their active roster before they could LTIR him. So that's something else to keep in mind here. With that in mind, talking about forwards and the trade deadline, one of the real, I don't want to say cheats or hacks of the trade deadline, but one of the really sound strategies as far as acquisitions this time of year is looking for guys who have certain traits that are going to translate well and putting them into more specialized roles. There are numerous examples over the last handful of seasons. The most obvious one that comes to mind is Blake Coleman. When the Devils traded him to the the Tampa Bay Lightning during that 2019-2020 season. Blake Coleman was playing pretty high in that Devils lineup that season, and the Lightning looked at it and said, we think we're going to be able to get more out of him if we put him in a more specialized role. If we have him bump his minutes down a smidge, we have him focus on defense, and we have him focus on penalty killing, we think there's something more to be gleaned from him than what the role he's currently playing in. So, for example, on that Devils team, he was averaging 17.02 per game. He was getting second line minutes in 2019-2020, the first 57 games of the regular season. In the 9 regular season games after that, Blake Coleman played 14.42. The season after that, he was playing 15.28. That tells you almost to a T what happened. The Lightning saw a player who had good skating, decent puck skills, good defensive instincts, and said, he's playing a lot of minutes on a bad team. If we take him and put him lower in our lineup, where he's going to get a minute or two less per game at 5-on-5, we're going to put him with more specialized players to support him in Yanni Gourde and Barclay Goodrow, and we're going to have a high-end checking line, because on a bad team, Yanni Gourde could have been a second-line center like he's been in Seattle. The Kraken are not a great offensive team. They don't score a ton of goals. And what makes Yanni Gourde good? His checking, his cycling, his ability to grind. That's a skill set you want to see in your bottom 6. You want to have skill-based guys like Coleman and Gourde who are good grinders, who can wear teams' defenses down, because in the playoffs, that matters. That accumulates. And if you go and look at the numbers that Coleman, Gourde, and Gaudreau generated over the playoffs, those 2 seasons, for those 2 seasons in the playoffs, 2019, 2020, 2020, 2021, Yanni Gourde, Barclay Goodrow, Blake Coleman, that trio played 486 5-on-5 minutes. They had 56% of the scoring chances, 60% of the goals, 55% of the expected goals, and 56% of the high danger chances. Now, none of those guys is driving their own bus. None of those guys is good enough where if you put them on a first or a second line on a good team, are they going to be able to carry the team? They're not going to be able to drive possession in any meaningful way to control the game state. But if you put them lower in your lineup, you give them favorable matchups, you tell them to focus on dump, chase, cycle, high to low, incorporate your defensemen as extra attackers, try to really leverage the other team, you're going to get great results. And that's really the framework I want to use to talk about the Oilers as far as deadline acquisitions, because there are a few players on this deadline list that are forwards that are more marquee. Brock Nelson is probably the biggest name that is supposedly available. And real quick disclaimer. Yes, technically Mikko Rantanen, Elias Pettersson, and Mitch Marner are all pending free agents and could conceivably be moved. Elias Pettersson is not, but there is some speculation the Canucks would like to reorganize their organization around Quinn Hughes, get a little bit younger, get a little bit cheaper. And Elias Pettersson is massively underperforming his expectations and what he's capable of. There's a real argument he could use a change of scenery, but I doubt the Canucks would trade him in division to the Oilers, short of McDavid, Draisaitl, or Evan Bouchard going the other way, and I just don't think the Oilers would do that, and I don't think the Canucks would trade him in the division. Mitch Marner, I don't think the Leafs are going to trade him anyway. I think they're going to find a way to make that situation work out well. And Mikko Rantanen, I think if the Hurricanes opt to trade Rantanen, they're going to want to get several smaller assets back in return as opposed to one big fish. Like conceivably, you could talk me into a world where there's an Evan Bouchard plus trade for Mikko Rantanen to be had, but I think that would do too much work to the Oilers defense. That would make it too prohibitive to conceivably put something like that together. Now, as for the players who are actually maybe, and I have to say actually maybe, because in the Islanders case, we don't know if Lou Lamoriello is actually going to do the right thing. The Islanders have quite a few players that make up a majority of these trade bait lists because they are in third to last in the Eastern Conference. They lost again on Monday night to the Rangers. They have several pending unrestricted free agents who all line up with each other. They have players with team control that have playoff experience like Jean-Gabriel Pageau that other organizations value. And it puts them in a weird spot because every fiber of your being would tell you it would make sense for the Islanders to trade those veterans on expiring contracts. So we start with Brock Nelson, $6 million per year, 12 years of NHL experience. He's got 31 points in 59 games this year. Nothing crazy, but 41 points in 59 games. Nothing crazy, but in an ideal world, you would be acquiring him to play third line center, kicking Henrique out to the wing, and by proxy, deepening your lineup because you would bump Janmark down to your third line. The one restricted free agent on here that I do think is interesting, and he's under contract, so he's not really a restricted free agent, but Dylan Cousins fits that profile. He's 23 years old. Cap hit is $7.1 million. Under contract for 5 more years. I don't really see a world where the Oilers could make this work. I don't think the Oilers have a player of comparable profile, short of, again, Bouchard, and Bouchard is clearly a better player. You would rather have him because of positional scarcity. The point per game caliber right-handed defenseman is an invaluable tool set, and Cousins, though I think talented, is not someone you would just trade Bouchard for. After that, we start to get closer to guys who make more sense. Someone like Brandon Tanev, who's 33, $3.5 million per year. You could slide him somewhere in your bottom 6. Yanni Gourde, you could put him in the Henrique spot, kick Henrique out to the left. Yanni Gourde makes $5.1 million against the cap for the remainder of this season, unrestricted free agent. Jean-Gabriel Pageau, he has next year under contract as well on the Islanders, $5 million per year. You get Lou to kick that down to 2.5 or 3.5. That becomes a lot more palatable. The most likely one I have on this list, and somebody I've really liked their game for a while, is Jake Evans of the Montreal Canadiens. He will not be kept long-term for the Oilers. He is not somebody they're going to be able to afford to keep after this year. He costs a modest $1.7 million against the cap right now, but he's due for a big raise after this year. He's somebody who's really spent the entirety of his restricted free agency in this flat cap environment, but I think he's someone who's going to greatly benefit from more money being in the system. After that, Kyle Palmieri, who has 19 goals, 21 assists in 59 games. He's 33. He's a pending unrestricted free agent. I think him going to a contender would make a big difference. I think that's closer to what the Oilers expected out of Victor Arvidsson this year. I suppose there's a world where you could convincingly trade Victor Arvidsson and a mid-round pick for Kyle Palmieri, in the idea of dumping Arvidsson's contract commitment for next year, shaving a little money off of the books next year, having Palmieri, who's got a bit more of a finishing stroke, to ride alongside Draisaitl, which is something I think would greatly help benefit Leon as well. Then there's Ryan Donato, who's got 21 goals, 22 assists in 58 games as a Blackhawk. He's an unrestricted free agent after this year. He only cost $2 million against the cap. He would be very cheap to acquire in terms of cap. And then the last player on this list is Scott Lawton, who's under contract for next year as well at $3 million per. I think he's the ideal third line center. I think on a good team, he might not be ready for the bright lights of a big game as a third line center. I think he's probably better suited for a smaller role, but the Flyers speak glowingly of him. He's got an important role in their room, and that does have some value for that type of role. We are going to take our first break of today's show. When we come back, we'll tackle the Oilers defense. Why, even though they signed John Klingberg, I do think there's a strong argument defense is their most needed positional upgrade right after this break. Are you looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios are one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help you keep feeling fuller longer. Personally, I love the no-shell variety. They're the perfect grab-and-go snack for busy days, whether I'm snacking at my desk, working on the show, on a road trip, or I'm just trying to get in a quick hit of protein to boost my macros. They're a solid go-to. Or if you're old school and you love cracking open the shell for the satisfying crunch, the in-shell options are a timeless favorite. Wonderful Pistachios are a complete protein providing all 9 essential amino acids. Whether you're running between meetings or dropping off the kids, Wonderful Pistachios are a snack that works as hard as you do. Get snacking and get cracking with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers as we're making our way through the Oilers trade deadline big board. And these lists are put together well in advance. So in the NHL, pro scouting departments, which is the NHL and the AHL, they are already cultivating these lists by early December. By about December, that's where organizations have an understanding of where they are in the standings, how likely they are to buy, the position groups, the skill sets, what they kind of need. And from there, pro scouts go out on assignment. They start to cultivate profiles. They put those profiles together. Then as the deadline draws closer, that's where teams will start to have their sit downs. They'll organize based on what they think makes sense, who fits the profile of what they're looking at. Then general managers will start to reach out. They'll start to try and develop a dialogue, because a lot of the time these are slow developing over an extended period of time, because general managers don't want to admit they're out of it until they have to. For a team like the Islanders that's having a really rough season, that is struggling to get people in the door to a new arena that's hosting the All-Star game next year, I think that's an organization that really, really wants to stay in the mix and try and push for a playoff spot, even if they ultimately don't make it. And that's really the only reason as to why Lou Lamoriello would extend Brock Nelson or Kyle Palmieri, is an understanding that it's okay if we don't make the playoffs, but we need to try and get people in this building. We need to try whatever we can do to stay competitive so people will show up, whether we're a good team or a bad team. We need to get people in the door because we're still relatively new in building out our foothold in this market. And look, I know the Islanders only moved a little bit further east from where they were previously at the Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum, but at the very least, it is concerning that the Islanders are not drawing particularly well, considering where they are the singular force on Long Island as far as representation. It's really just Billy Joel and Islanders. There are the Long Island Ducks, there are the Hamptons, but those don't carry the same gravitas as a professional sports franchise or a musician that really is the outward facing look for what you represent. And with that in mind, The Islanders don't have a defenseman that we could be talking about here, but at large, talking about defensemen, teams being out of it, defense as a position group is interesting in the respect that there are wide swaths of skill sets that fall into this box as far as being useful. We have guys like Evan Bouchard who don't throw a hit at all. And we have guys like Jamie Alexiak, who are 6'4" and throw their body around at every last possibility, who love to block shots, who play physically. And I think if you're the Oilers, you are looking at the last month of results you've gotten from John Klingberg with a bit of concern. Not that it's a problem. It's not like you committed to him long term. He's not getting a lot of money, but you don't feel good about that. And it's important the Oilers signed him when they did and played him like they did because they needed to know. And there's no way to know until a guy plays on your team. And Klingberg, coming off a long layoff, hadn't played hockey since the fall of 2023. I think that's something that bears worth repeating, that even though his results haven't been great, he hasn't played a ton. There is plenty of room for him to get better as he gets more comfortable. But at the very same time, if you're the Edmonton Oilers, you can't afford to wait for John Klingberg to figure it out. You got 20 regular season games left. You probably want to win 12 to 15 of those to feel good about the state of your team going into the postseason, because you don't want to limp in. If you limp into the playoffs, you're going to have to kick it into gear even shorter term. And look, even if you play the Kings again, you don't want to tempt fate. I'm going to knock on my head and on my desk saying that the Oilers, even if they play the Kings, you don't want to tempt fate again. That, oh, we beat them 3 times in a row, 4 times. What's the difference? We got this. You don't want to do that. That is not a good mindset to have. And I don't think the Oilers are actively going to be thinking that, but that's human nature. You get used to things, you get comfortable. And I hate to give it to the grind setters, but comfort is not a good thing in a competitive space. If you're comfortable, you're not grinding as hard as you need to be or could be. And that's holding you back, whether we're talking about professionally, physically, in terms of your fitness. You got to have a little bit of discomfort. That's the point of lifting weights. That discomfort you feel on the decline of pulling a heavy bar down, that is pressure. That is building muscle. It's annoying that life works that way, but you don't get better without stress. You don't get better with pressure. There are healthy amounts of stress and pressure. When I find them, I'll let you know. But until then, so with that in mind, the defensive group of candidates is significantly less robust. Going into this deadline, I think when I did Oilers Deadline 1.0, I said Ivan Provorov would probably be the most notable player available. The Blue Jackets are in a playoff spot right now, and Provorov's only 27. I could very easily see those two sides working out an extension, or the Blue Jackets opting to roll with it to try and push for a playoff spot with Provorov in the fold and worrying about an extension later. There's Bowen Byram, who's a restricted free agent on the Sabres, $3.8 million per year, 7 goals, 22 assists. He's played 58 games. I think Byram gets traded in the summer by Buffalo unless they really get blown away in season. Buffalo wants guys who can play right now, who are young and cost controlled. I think Bowen Byram's a good candidate for like a double change of scenery, similar to what we saw for the Jamie Drysdale Cutter Gauthier trade from last season. After that, Mario Ferraro, not really someone I think fits for what the Oilers want. He's not the best of skaters. He's not that old. He's not that expensive, but I don't think he fits. Brian Dumoulin, kind of the same boat. I think Brian Dumoulin would be a redundancy for Brett Kulak, and Kulak's just better. Jamie Alexiak, I don't really think fits. Rasmus Ristolainen, he has 2 years of team control at $5.1 million per. You would need to find a way to convince the Flyers to retain salary for the next 2 seasons. And as a team like the Flyers that are close to wanting to push some chips in, I think they would rather have Ristolainen on the team and having those salary retention spots available should the opportunity come to upgrade somewhere else in their lineup. Then David Savard, Matt Grzelcyk, I think that's most likely the tier of defensemen you will see the Oilers looking to add. Matt Grzelcyk, Brian Dumoulin, David Savard, somebody of that ilk who a little bit of experience on the older side, kills penalties, lower event, lower volatility than what Klingberg or Ty Emberson or Troy Stetcher bring to the table. I don't think any of those guys are astonishing or blow you away, but I do think they all offer a little bit more stability than what you currently have at the position. And I think that's something that most NHL teams really value when we're talking about playoff hockey. We're going to take one more break on today's show. When we come back, we'll tie a bow on this episode talking about the goaltending position, which is all anybody can seem to talk about. Be right back. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers ahead of the trade deadline on Friday. So my tentative content plan for the rest of the week, we will have a game episode on Wednesday after their game. Thursday, we will have something looking ahead to Friday. Friday, I will be streaming almost all day. My plan is to stream from 10 a.m. Eastern to 4:35 p.m. Eastern, somewhere in there. I've got a litany of guests lined up. I do hope you'll stop by. It'll be a nice time to just talk puck and get background, get ideas from a lot of different people who cover a variety of teams to really try and give you guys a fully encompassing landscape of where the NHL's at. And the thing I love about the trade deadline, and I said this the other day, but I do think it's worth repeating, and it's something for you to frame your thinking around. I love the trade deadline because it's one of the very rare opportunities we get as fans to understand what our team thinks about itself, what our general manager thinks about the team. Because if they go out and get a Mario Ferraro or a Jamie Alexiak, that tells me Stan Bowman thinks the team is small. They need to be better on the penalty kill. They need to block more shots. If they go out and get Bowen Byram, that tells me they think they need more upside. They need more offensive impact from the back end. We'll talk about it from the forward perspective. If you go out and get, Brock Nelson, that tells me you think you don't have enough scoring. If you go get Jake Evans, that tells me you think you need better defense, forechecking, and cycling. With that in mind, you get a better understanding real quick of what people think, and it's hard. As a fan, it's really difficult to get an honest account of what your GM or your coach thinks about his team because there's no benefit to them being honest. All that can happen from being honest is something bad. You're always better off as a stakeholder obfuscating, of being obtuse, of being opaque, of not giving out any details, because if you give out leverage and you give out ploys, you're losing tools in your toolbox. It's why, even though Stan Bowman was on the record with Frank Saravalli saying he felt good about the Oilers' goaltending room, he didn't think there was a goalie out there that was discernibly better than what they currently had. There's no reason for him to say that on the record, honestly. It would be stupid for Stan Bowman to come out and say, yeah, I think we need a goalie, because that hurts your goalie's confidence, both Skinner and Pickard. Then it also tells guys you were prospectively trading with, I need a goalie. Charge me as much as you want, because that's how trades work. And yes, there are some GMs who are a little nicer about it than others, who want to make a nice deal for both sides. You're not going to get very far in the NHL looking for trades that work out for both sides. I think there are general managers who do that. I don't want them running my team, because there are killers out there who will take advantage of you if you try and be nice. With that in mind, talking about the goalie room, not only do goalies have the hardest time adapting because of environmental factors, they get the least amount of time to do it in, especially if you're adding somebody who's in a bit more of a tandem or even a straight backup role. Like, even if you go out and add some even if you go out and add a goalie like Jonathan Quick, who we'll talk about, even though I don't think the Rangers are going to trade him, if you add Jonathan Quick and he plays 5 of the final 20 games or 8 of the final 20 games, he's going to have a really hard time getting acclimated playing once a week over the course of the next 5 weeks until the playoffs start. And then if he has to come in a pinch in the playoffs because Skinner's underperforming or Skinner's hurt, how quick can he ramp back up into being the starter's mentality? I don't think the Oilers are in a position where they could add to their goalie room, even though I could argue it might be their single most important need. I think defense is their actual biggest need and the most likely that they're going to go out and improve. But I don't think there's a goalie trade to be had, which is what's frustrating. The only way I think you see a major goalie trade is if Skinner's going the other way. If there were a way, and this is entirely supposition, I am not reporting anything, I have not heard anything. If there was a world in which you could get one of Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen or Devin Levy from the Sabres for Stuart Skinner and some assets, I would do that. If I could go get Jake Allen from the Devils, I would try and do that. If I could try and get Quick from the Rangers, I would do that. Now, I don't think you want to trade Stuart Skinner. I don't think he has a ton of value. I don't think the goalie for goalie swap is a particularly effective maneuver for either party, because if either party felt good about their goalie, they wouldn't trade them because there aren't 32 good goalies. So by trading your goalie, you're admitting you don't think you have a good one, or their cost is so exorbitant that they're no longer worth it. Because if you look at someone like Jacob Markstrom, who got traded, who's still an effective goalie, the Flames looked at it and said, we'd rather have Dustin Wolf. He's cheaper, and we think we can get close to similar performances out of him. And when you have to cut costs, sometimes that happens. Or if you're like Tampa Bay several years ago and you graduate your backup Vasilevsky into being a starter, you trade Ben Bishop because you want to spend that money elsewhere. And the candidates for goalie to acquire it's not a robust list. It's the shortest list I have. It's not exciting either. The best stats-wise is Karel Vejmelka of the Utah Hockey Club, but it's been reported that Utah and Vejmelka are working towards an extension ahead of Friday to keep him in the fold. He's got the best stats of anyone on this list. After that is John Gibson, who is under contract for 2 more years. He's 31 years old. He's played in 25 games this year. He's got an under 500 wins-loss record, goals against average of 2.8, a save percentage of .909. I don't think John Gibson works for the Oilers because the money into future years. I think the Oilers are going to try and keep their books as clear as they can over the next handful of years, so they have maximum maneuverability around Connor Leon and Evan Bouchard. After that, you're not going to like the lists. It's Jonathan Quick, who isn't leaving the East Coast. Quick is an East Coast guy. He's from Connecticut. He was at his son's hockey game on Monday morning up in Connecticut. Can't do that if you're traded to Edmonton. And Quick has waited his entire NHL career to come back to the East Coast where he's from. I think the Rangers will ask him if he'd be willing to relocate. And I suppose if the right team came along, maybe, but I don't think I would not get my hopes up if you really had your heart set on Jonathan Quick. And then after that, do you really want Alexander Georgiev or Vitek Vanacek from the Sharks? And look, I understand the Sharks are putrid. Their stats are never going to be an accurate reflection of what they are. The Avalanche threw their hands up and said they were done with Georgiev, and the Avalanche are a team that have Stanley Cup aspirations. I think that tells you a lot. I think Vanacek is fine in a tandem, but I don't think he's discernibly different, that much better than Stuart Skinner. If you could get him for a 5th or a 6th round pick or a 4th round pick, something like that, I suppose you would rather have him be the backup than Calvin Pickard, but that's not exciting. That's not something you really want to do if you really have to maximize your cap space. So real quick, I think the group they most likely add to is forward. I think defense is probably the most pressing. And goalie, I don't think there's a goalie trade to be had that's even really worth considering. So I think you really are going to see them go out and add a forward and a D and hold on to their butts and hope for the best from Stuart Skinner. That'll do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Join the show for the stretch run. I will talk to you guys tomorrow before we get out of here. Thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen of the day. Now go check out Locked On NHL with all of your favorite experts from across the wide range of Locked On shows, covering all of the biggest stories across the league with their local expertise. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.